England, 1809. The morning began like hundreds of mornings before it. The sky above the small village was grey and heavy, promising rain before noon. Thin smoke drifted from chimneys across the settlement, as families woke to another day of labour, struggle and uncertainty. In a tiny cottage at the edge of the village, Mary Carter was already awake. The room was cold. The fire from the night before had nearly died, leaving only a few glowing embers beneath a blanket of ash. Mary pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and quietly rose from the bed. Beside her, her husband Thomas still slept. For a moment, she watched him. His face looked older than his 36 years. Years of hard labor had carved deep lines around his eyes. His hands were rough and scarred. His shoulders carried the weight of a life spent lifting, hauling, digging, and enduring. Yet when he slept, he looked peaceful, almost young. Mary smiled faintly. She knew that in less than an hour, he would leave for work once again. Before sunrise, returning after dark, exhausted, hungry, and still worrying about how they would feed their children. Such was life for families like theirs, not miserable enough to attract attention, not fortunate enough to escape hardship, just ordinary people trapped between survival and disaster. A single illness, a single accident, a single missed day of work. That was all it took for everything to fall apart. And neither Mary nor Thomas knew that this would be the last morning they would ever spend together. Outside, the wind rattled the cottage walls. Inside, Mary moved carefully so she would not wake the children. 9-year-old Samuel slept on a straw mattress near the fireplace. His younger sister, 7-year-old Eliza, was curled beside him beneath a patched blanket. In the corner lay little William, only 4 years old. His cheeks were thin, too thin, like many children of poor families during this time. Food was never guaranteed. Every loaf mattered, every potato mattered, every coin mattered. Mary crossed the room and looked into the cupboard. Half a loaf, a few onions. A small piece of cheese. Not enough, not nearly enough. But it would have to do. She cut the bread carefully, making each portion seem larger than it really was. A skill she had learned years ago. Poor mothers became experts at creating the illusion of abundance. Children noticed hunger. Pomfrets tried to hide it. The floor creaked behind her. Thomas was awake. "Morning," he said quietly. Mary turned and smiled. "Morning," he stretched slowly and winced. His back hurt again. It always hurt. Years of physical labor had made pain a permanent companion. "You should rest today," Mary said. Thomas laughed softly. Rest? The word sounded almost absurd. "Who'll pay for bread if I rest?" Mary had no answer. Neither did he, because both knew the truth. Poor men did not have the luxury of resting. If they did not work, they did not eat. Simple as that. Thomas dressed quickly. His clothes were worn and patched. His boots had been repaired so many times that little of the original leather remained. Yet replacing them would cost money they did not have. Everything cost money, and money was always scarce. The children woke as breakfast was prepared. Samuel rubbed his eyes. Eliza yawned. Little William immediately asked the question children always asked. "What's for breakfast?" Mary smiled despite herself. "Bread." William frowned. "Again bread yesterday, bread today." "Bread tomorrow." Thomas ruffled the boy's hair. "One day we'll feast like kings." The children laughed, even Mary laughed, not because they believed it, but because imagining it felt good. For a few moments, the cottage felt warm, comfortable, almost happy. The family sat together, sharing the simple meal, talking about ordinary things, the weather, the neighbors, the coming harvests. No one realized these would become precious memories. The final breakfast, the final conversation, the final goodbye. When Thomas finished eating, He stood and grabbed his coat. Mary walked him to the door, as she often did. The cold air rushed inside when he opened it. Thomas kissed her forehead. A small gesture, still routine. The kind people barely notice when it happens. Yet years later, Mary would remember that moment with painful clarity. Every detail, every word, every expression. Because it was the last kiss he would ever give her. "I'll be back before dark," he said. Mary nodded. "Be careful." Thomas smiled, then he stepped outside and disappeared into the grey morning. Neither of them knew that fate had already made its decision. The worksite stood several miles away, a construction project, dangerous, poorly regulated. Like countless workplaces across England in 1809, safety was rarely considered. Workers were cheap, lives were cheaper. Thomas joined dozens of labourers already at work. Men carried stone, lifted timber, dug foundations, moved earth chair after hour, without complaint, because complaint solved nothing. Employers could easily replace them. There were always more poor men searching for work, always more desperate fathers willing to take dangerous jobs. Thomas worked steadily, as he always did. By midday, clouds darkened overhead. Rain began falling. The ground became slick. The wooden scaffolding grew slippery. Several workers exchanged nervous glances. Conditions were becoming dangerous. But stopping work was not an option. Not for men paid by the day. Not for men whose families depended upon every penny. The foreman barked orders. Work continued. The rain intensified. Thomas climbed higher, carrying heavy materials, step by step, board by board. The wind howled. A worker below shouted something. Another man pointed upward, then a crack, sharp, sudden. Terrifying, the sound cut through the rain. Several heads turned. The scaffold shifted. Just slightly. Then more. Wood splintered. Men screamed. And in a single horrifying instant, everything collapsed. The structure gave way. Timbers crashed downward. Stone tumbled through the air. Workers scrambled desperately. Some escaped. Others did not. Thomas never had a chance. The falling beams struck him before he could move. The world exploded into chaos. Dust, rain screaming, broken wood, blood. For several moments nobody knew how many men were trapped beneath the wreckage. Workers rushed forward, ignoring their own safety, pulling debris away with trembling hands, calling names. Searching, praying. Thomas was found beneath a massive beam, unconscious, broken, barely breathing. Someone shouted for help. Another ran for a doctor. But everyone already understood. The injuries were too severe. Far too severe. The doctor arrived nearly an hour later. By then there was little he could do. Medicine in 1809 was limited, especially for the poor. He examined Thomas briefly, then lowered his head. The surrounding workers understood immediately. One man removed his cap. Another crossed himself. A third looked away. Thomas Carter was dead. 36 years old. Husband, father provider gone. And several miles away, Mary knew nothing. She continued with her day. Cleaning, mending clothes, preparing supper. Waiting for her husband to return, just as she always did. The afternoon passed slowly. Rain tapped against the windows. The children played quietly. William asked when his father would come home. Soon, Mary said. The answer felt natural. Automatic, because Thomas always came home, no matter how tired, no matter how late, no matter how difficult the day, he always returned. Except today, as evening approached, Mary began to worry. Not much, just enough to glance repeatedly toward the road. Maybe work had run late. Maybe the weather had delayed everyone. It happened sometimes. Still, a strange feeling settled in her stomach. A feeling she could not explain. Outside, darkness began spreading across the village. Workers returned home, one by one. Families reunited, doors opened, voices echoed. Lamps were lit, but Thomas did not appear. Mary stood near the window, watching, waiting, listening. Then she saw two figures approaching the cottage. Not Thomas, two men, walking slowly, too slowly. And suddenly that strange feeling became fear. The men stopped outside. Neither moved immediately. Neither knocked. They simply stood there, looking at the door, looking at each other, as if neither wanted to be the one who delivered the news. Mary's heart began pounding. She already knew, somehow deep inside. Before a word was spoken, she knew. The knock came, 3 slow strikes. Mary opened the door, rain fell behind them. One of the men removed his hat, the other stared at the ground. And in that terrible silence, the world seemed to stop. Mary, the man's voice cracked. She could barely breathe. There was an accident. The words hit her like a physical blow. No, a whisper, barely audible. The man swallowed. I'm sorry. Mary shook her head. No, he didn't survive. Everything disappeared. The room, the rain, the voices, the world. For a moment she could hear nothing at all. Only a strange ringing in her ears. Her knees nearly gave way. One of the men reached forward to steady her. The children appeared behind her, confused, frightened. Samuel looked from the men to his mother, then back again. And slowly he began to understand. The realization appeared in his eyes, a child forced to grow older in a single moment. Mary could not stop staring, as if refusing to believe would somehow change reality. But reality remained unchanged. Thomas was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. That night, nobody slept. The children cried themselves exhausted. Mary sat alone beside the dying fire, motionless, silent, staring into the darkness. Hours passed. Her mind replayed the morning endlessly. The breakfast, the smile, the goodbye, the promise. I'll be back before dark. The words haunted her. Outside, the wind continued blowing. Inside, a terrible truth slowly emerged. Grief was only the beginning. Thomas was not just her husband. He was their income, their protection, their survival. Without him, there would be no wages next week. No wages the week after. No wages ever again. And as dawn approached, another thought entered her mind, one even more frightening than death itself. The rent was due in 6 days, and she had no idea how she would pay it. The morning after Thomas died, the sun rose exactly as it always had. Birds sang, smoke drifted from chimneys. Workers walked toward their jobs. Life continued, the world had not stopped. But for Mary Carter, it felt as though it had. She had not slept, not even for a moment. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas leaving the cottage. She heard his voice. She remembered his smile. Then reality returned. He was gone, gone forever. The small cottage felt strangely empty without him. His coat still hung beside the door. His boots still sat where he had left them. His cup remained on the table. Every object seemed determined to remind her of what she had lost. Across the room, Samuel sat silently, only 9 years old, yet his face looked older this morning. Children who experienced tragedy often changed overnight, and Samuel was no exception. Little William still did not fully understand. He kept asking questions. When is father coming home? The first time he asked, Mary could not answer. The second time, tears filled her eyes. By the third time, Samuel gently pulled his younger brother aside and quietly explained. William began crying. The sound broke Mary's heart, because she knew it would not be the last time. The boy would ask for his father hundreds of times in the coming years, and every answer would hurt. By afternoon, reality began arriving at the cottage. Not emotional reality, financial reality, and it was far less forgiving. A neighbor named Mrs. Harris visited first. She brought a loaf of bread, a kind gesture, one Mary deeply appreciated. But kindness could not solve poverty. A loaf of bread lasted a day. Rent lasted a month. Mrs. Harris sat beside her. "I'm so sorry, Mary." Mary nodded. The words had already become familiar. Everyone said the same thing. Everyone meant well. Yet sympathy did not feed children. It did not pay debts. It did not replace a husband. After a few minutes, Mrs. Harris hesitated. Then she spoke softly. "Have you thought about what you'll do?" Mary stared at her. The question felt impossible. What would she do? She had 3 children, no savings, no property, no education, and now no husband. A woman in her position had few options. Very few. Some found work washing clothes. Others cleaned houses. Some worked as servants. Most earned almost nothing. And many eventually entered the workhouse. The very thought terrified her. Everyone feared the workhouse. Everyone, because once inside, life often became even harder. Families were separated, rules were strict, dignity disappeared. The poor knew stories. Stories whispered from one family to another. Stories of mothers separated from children. Stories of hunger. Stories of despair. Mary pushed the thought away. No, not yet. There had to be another way. 2 days later, Thomas was buried. The funeral was small, painfully small, because poverty rarely allowed grand farewells. A few neighbors attended. Several workers from the construction site came as well. The minister spoke. The prayers were read, and then Thomas Carter disappeared beneath the earth, just like that. 36 years of life reduced to a wooden coffin and a patch of ground. Mary stood frozen, the children beside her. The cold wind tugged at her dress, yet she barely felt it. She kept staring at the grave, unable to move, unable to accept what had happened. Finally, Samuel touched her arm. "Mother." His voice sounded frightened. Mary looked down. The boy's eyes were full of tears. Suddenly she understood something. She could not collapse, not completely. 3 children still depended on her, no matter how impossible life seemed. No matter how much she wanted to sit beside that grave forever, she had responsibilities, and responsibility did not wait for grief. 3 days after the funeral, the family ran out of food. Not completely, but almost. The bread was gone. The cheese was gone. Only a few potatoes remained. Mary carefully counted the coins she possessed. The total was devastating. Not enough. Not nearly enough. She counted again. Then again, as if numbers might change through repetition. They did not. She had less money than she feared. Far less. A terrible realization settled over her. Thomas's final wages would never arrive. The accident had happened before payment, and employers rarely showed generosity. Workers who died often left families with nothing. Mary felt panic rising inside her chest. For years Thomas had stood between the family and disaster. Now that barrier had vanished, and disaster was approaching fast. The next morning, Mary began searching for work. The children stayed with a neighbor. Samuel protested. He wanted to help. He wanted to be useful. The boy already understood more than he should, but Mary refused. "Stay here." He nodded reluctantly. Mary walked through the village, then beyond it, knocking on doors, asking questions, seeking any opportunity. Every rejection felt heavier than the last. No positions, no need, already hired someone. Come back next month. Each answer chipped away at her hope. Hours passed, her feet ached, rain began falling. Still she continued, because stopping would accomplish nothing. Finally she reached a larger house belonging to a wealthy merchant's family. A servant answered. Mary explained her situation. The woman listened quietly, then disappeared inside. Several minutes later she returned. We need laundry done. Mary felt relief flood through her body at last. Work. Any work. How much? She asked. The servant named a figure. Mary's heart sank. The payment was shockingly low. Yet she accepted immediately. Because desperate people could not negotiate. Desperate people took whatever was offered. Even when it was unfair. Especially when it was unfair. The work was exhausting. Buckets of water, heavy fabrics, scrubbing, lifting, wringing, horrors of labor. For a handful of coins, by evening her hands were red and raw. Her back burned with pain. Yet when she received payment, she knew the truth. It was not enough for rent, not enough for food, not enough for survival. Even if she worked every available day, the numbers simply did not work. The realization terrified her, because poverty was not always caused by laziness or poor decisions. Sometimes mathematics alone trapped people. The wages were too low, the expenses too high. No amount of effort could change the equation. 1 week after Thomas's death, the landlord arrived. Mary heard his footsteps before the knock came. Her stomach tightened instantly. She knew why he was there. Everyone knew. The rent was due. The knock sounded harsh, demanding, unforgiving. Mary opened the door. The landlord stood outside, a tall man with a stern expression. He removed his hat, though not out of kindness. Only habit, Mrs. Carter. Mary nodded. I know why you're here, the man sighed. I've heard about your husband. For a brief moment, Mary hoped compassion might follow. It did not. But rent is still rent. The words struck harder than she expected. I just need more time. The landlord crossed his arms. How much time? Mary hesitated, because she did not know. A week? A month? Longer? She had no answer. The landlord noticed, and his expression hardened further. I can give you 2 weeks. Mary felt a small surge of relief. Then he continued. After that, I'll need payment. The relief vanished. 2 weeks. That was all. 14 days. 14 days to somehow earn enough money to keep a roof over her children's heads. The task felt impossible. Yet impossible tasks had become her new reality. That night the children ate boiled potatoes. Nothing else. No meat, no bread, no cheese. Only potatoes. William complained. Then he stopped, because even at 4 years old, he sensed something was wrong. The cottage felt different now. Fear lived there, an invisible guest sitting at every meal, watching every conversation, following every thought. After the children slept, Mary remained awake. The fire crackled softly, rain tapped against the roof. And for the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to think about the future, the real future. Not tomorrow, not next week. Months from now, years from now. The vision terrified her. Children growing hungrier, debts increasing, opportunities disappearing, a workhouse looming closer every day. She buried her face in her hands. For several minutes she cried silently. Not because she missed Thomas, though she did. Not because life was unfair, though it was. She cried because she finally understood something dreadful. His death had not ended their suffering. It had only begun. The following morning brought even worse news. A neighbor arrived carrying gossip from the village. Another laborer from the construction accident had survived, badly injured, but alive. And his employer was refusing compensation, refusing assistance, refusing responsibility. The message was clear. If living victims received no help, dead workers' families could expect even less. Mary listened quietly, then thanked the neighbor. When the woman left, Mary stared at the floor. Hope disappeared a little more. No payment was coming. No miracle was coming. No rescue was coming. Only her exhausted hands, only her determination, and 3 hungry children. Late that evening, Samuel approached her. The boy looked nervous. Mother? Yes. He stared at the floor, then finally spoke. I could work. The words broke her heart. 9 years old, 9. And already considering labor. Already preparing to sacrifice childhood for survival. Mary knelt beside him. No, but father used to say. I said no. Her voice cracked. Samuel fell silent. Mary hugged him tightly, because she understood something the boy did not. Once childhood disappeared, it rarely returned. And poverty had a habit of stealing childhood first. Days passed. Work remained scarce. Money disappeared quickly. Food portions grew smaller. The children noticed. Of course they noticed. Children always notice hunger, even when adults pretend otherwise. Mary skipped meals whenever possible, telling the children she wasn't hungry, a lie, but a necessary one, because mothers often became the final barrier between starvation and their children. Even if it meant suffering themselves, by the end of the second week, only a few coins remained. Not enough, still not enough. The landlord would return soon, and when he did, Mary would have no answer, no payment, no solution, nothing. Only fear. As darkness fell that night, there was another knock at the door. Mary froze. Her heart immediately knew who it was. The landlord had returned, earlier than expected. The children looked up nervously. Samuel already understood. The boy's face went pale. Mary opened the door slowly. The landlord stood there holding a folded paper. His expression revealed everything before he spoke. Mrs. Carter. Mary's stomach twisted. The man extended the paper toward her. She stared at it, then at him. What is it? His answer came quietly, but its impact was devastating. A notice. Mary felt the blood drain from her face. The landlord lowered his eyes. You have 7 days. Silence filled the doorway. 7 days, 1 week, one final chance. After that, the cottage would no longer belong to them. And for the first time since Thomas died, Mary faced a terrifying possibility. Not just poverty, homelessness. 7 days. That was all the time Mary Carter had left. 7 days before she and her children would lose their home. 7 days before the small cottage, the place where her children had been born, where Thomas had laughed, worked, and dreamed, would belong to someone else. She stood in the doorway long after the landlord left. The notice trembled in her hands, behind her. The children sat silently. No one spoke, because everyone understood. Even little William sensed the fear hanging in the room. The cottage had become quieter since Thomas died. Now it felt almost haunted, not by ghosts, but by uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that steals sleep, the kind that follows a person every waking moment. That night, a storm rolled across the countryside. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rattled the walls. Mary sat beside the fire, staring at the eviction notice. Again and again she read the same words. 7 days. She had already sold nearly everything of value. Thomas's spare coat, their extra blanket, a wooden chair, a few kitchen items. None of it had been enough. The coins disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Food, rent, fuel, every necessity demanded payment, and poverty never stopped collecting its debts. Across the room, Samuel pretended to sleep, but Mary knew he was awake. The boy had become watchful, quiet, too quiet. Children should worry about games, about adventures, about scraped knees and muddy boots. Instead, Samuel worried about rent, about food, about survival. It was a burden no child should carry. Yet poverty placed such burdens on children every day. The next morning Mary woke before sunrise. The fire had gone out. The cottage felt freezing. Winter was approaching, and winter was merciless to poor families. The wealthy complained about cold weather. The poor feared it. Cold meant sickness. Cold meant higher costs. Cold meant death. especially for those already struggling. Mary wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside. The village was still asleep. Only a few workers moved through the darkness. Beginning another day of labor, she watched them. For a moment she imagined Thomas among them, walking toward work, returning home at sunset, smiling at the children. But the illusion vanished quickly. Reality remained. Thomas was gone, and she was alone. Over the next few days, Mary searched desperately for additional work. She walked farther than before, into neighboring villages, along muddy roads, across fields. Anywhere there might be opportunity. The journey exhausted her. But desperation creates endurance. People discover hidden strength when they have no other choice. At one farmhouse she asked for work. The owner looked her up and down. "You've done farm labor?" "No." He shook his head. "Then I don't need you." At another house she offered laundry services. The woman already had help. At another she offered sewing. No vacancies, no openings, no need. Each rejection felt like another door slamming shut. Food became scarcer. Mary began dividing meals into smaller portions, then smaller still. A loaf that once lasted 2 days now needed to last 4. Potatoes became a luxury. Meat had already disappeared. The children never complained openly, but she noticed. William stared at empty plates. Eliza chewed slowly, trying to make meals last longer. Samuel often claimed he wasn't hungry, a lie he thought his mother didn't notice. But she did, because she had been telling the same lie herself. One evening Mary awoke to a strange sound. At first she thought it was the wind. Then she realized it was coming from inside the cottage. A soft cry. She rushed toward the children. Little William was shivering beneath his blanket. His skin felt hot, far too hot. Mary's heart immediately filled with dread. Fever. The word terrified families in 1809. A fever could mean many things. Some harmless, others deadly. And poor families had few defenses. Doctors cost money. Medicine cost money. Everything cost money. Money she did not possess. William opened his eyes. "Mama." His voice sounded weak. Mary forced herself to smile. "It's all right." But fear gripped her chest, because she wasn't sure it was. For 3 days, William remained ill. The fever rose, then fell, then rose again. Mary barely left his side. Sleep became impossible. She cooled his forehead with damp cloths, whispered comforting words, prayed constantly. The other children watched nervously. They had already lost their father. The possibility of losing William too felt unbearable. At one point Mary considered borrowing money for a doctor. But from whom? The villagers were poor themselves. Many struggled to survive. And debt often created new disasters. In the end she had no choice but to wait and hope. Fortunately, after several agonizing days, William began improving. The fever broke. His breathing steadied. Colour returned to his face. Relief flooded through the cottage. For the first time in weeks, Mary allowed herself a small smile. Yet the crisis had cost precious time. Only 2 days remained before eviction. 2 days, and she still lacked the money. The following afternoon, Samuel disappeared. At first, Mary assumed he was nearby, playing, walking, exploring. But hours passed, and he did not return. Panic began rising. The village was not large. Children rarely wandered far. Mary searched the nearby roads, called his name, asked neighbors. No one had seen him. Then, just as the sun began setting, Samuel appeared. He looked exhausted. Mud covered his boots. His clothes were dirty. And in his hand he carried several coins. Mary stared at him, confused. "Where did you get those?" Samuel hesitated, then answered quietly. "I worked." The words struck her like lightning. "What?" "I carried sacks for a merchant." Mary felt anger and heartbreak collide inside her. "You promised me." Samuel lowered his eyes. "I know. You're 9 years old. We need money." His voice cracked. The simple truth silenced her, because he wasn't wrong. They did need money desperately. Samuel opened his hand. The coins glimmered in the fading light. Not much, but enough to buy food, enough to help, enough to prove that childhood had already begun slipping away. Mary hugged him tightly, and for the first time since Thomas died, she cried openly. Not because of grief, but because poverty was slowly transforming her son into a man, much too soon. That night the family shared a modest meal, their first proper meal in days. The children smiled. William even laughed. For a few precious moments, normal life seemed possible again. Then reality returned. Tomorrow was the deadline. The landlord would come. And they still did not have enough money. Not even close. Morning arrived cold and grey. Mary spent the day calculating every possible option. Every possibility ended the same way: failure. There simply wasn't enough. No matter how carefully she counted, no matter how much she hoped, the numbers refused to change. Late in the afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Mary's stomach tightened immediately. The landlord, it had to be. She opened the door slowly, and there he stood, hat in hand, inscript unreadable. The children gathered behind her, silent. Waiting, the landlord cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter." Mary said nothing. What was there to say? She could not pay. Both knew it. The landlord glanced past her, at the children, at the nearly empty cottage, at the life falling apart before his eyes. For a brief moment something changed in his expression. Not kindness exactly, but discomfort, perhaps guilt, perhaps pity, perhaps simply recognition. Recognition that poverty could destroy anyone, even hard-working people, even good people, even families who had done nothing wrong. He looked back at Mary, then sighed heavily. "You're still short." Mary nodded. The words felt like a death sentence. "Yes." Silence followed, long, painful. Then the landlord spoke again. "There may be another option." Mary stared at him. Hope and fear collided instantly. "What option?" The man hesitated, as though he disliked the answer himself. Finally he spoke. "The parish is accepting new families." Mary's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what he meant. The workhouse, the very place she had feared from the beginning. The place poor families whispered about. The place where husbands, wives, and children were often separated. The place where dignity disappeared. The place people entered only when every other choice was gone. The landlord lowered his eyes. "I suggest you speak with them." Mary felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. The workhouse, after everything, after every struggle, after every sacrifice, this was where the road had led. Not freedom, not opportunity, not rescue. The workhouse behind her. Samuel quietly took her hand, and for the first time, Mary realized a terrible truth. The fight to keep her family together was about to become much harder than the fight against poverty itself. The word echoed in Mary's mind long after the landlord had left. Workhouse. For weeks she had feared it. For years she had heard stories about it. Now it stood before her as the only remaining path. The cottage felt unusually silent that evening. No one spoke much. The children sensed something serious had happened. Even little William remained quiet. Outside, darkness settled over the village. Inside, Mary sat beside the dying fire, staring into the flames, trying to imagine what came next. Trying to imagine a future she had never wanted. A future without choices. Because that was the cruelest part of poverty. People often imagined the poor simply made bad decisions. But poverty was not a collection of bad choices. Poverty was the absence of choices. and Mary was running out of them. The following morning she walked to the parish office. The children came with her. The building stood near the church, plain, cold, unwelcoming. Several other families waited outside. Their faces told familiar stories: exhaustion, fear, hunger, defeat. Mary noticed a woman holding an infant. A boy perhaps 10 years old stood beside her. Neither smiled, neither spoke. They looked exactly how Mary felt, broken by circumstances they could not control. Eventually, a parish official called her name. She entered. The man behind the desk barely looked at her. He had seen hundreds like her: widows, laborers, orphans. The poor arrived constantly. Their stories differed, their desperation did not. He asked questions: age, children, occupation, income, property, savings. The interview felt less like conversation and more like an inventory of failure. When it ended, the official folded his papers. You qualify. Mary felt no relief, only dread. The official continued. You and your children may enter next week. Then he added the words she feared most. Families are not always housed together. Mary froze. What does that mean? The man adjusted his glasses. Men, women, and children are usually separated. Mary stared at him, unable to speak. The official's expression remained unchanged. To him, it was procedure. To Mary, it was unimaginable. Her husband was already gone. Now they wanted to take her children too. That night she barely slept. She watched Samuel, Eliza, William. The thought of losing them terrified her more than hunger ever had. A mother could endure hunger, cold, pain, but separation? That was different. That was a wound no blanket could warm, no meal could heal. Yet every alternative seemed impossible. No home, no income, no protection. The workhouse promised survival, but survival carried a price. 3 days later they packed their belongings. The task took less than an hour. That fact alone felt heartbreaking. A lifetime reduced to a few possessions: several blankets, a cooking pot, some clothes, a handful of personal items. Nothing more. The cottage looked empty, strange, unfamiliar. Mary walked through each room slowly. Memories appeared everywhere. Thomas sitting near the fire, the children laughing, winter evenings spent together, ordinary moments, moments she had once taken for granted. Now they felt priceless. At the doorway she paused. One final look, then she closed the door and walked away. The workhouse appeared on the horizon shortly after noon, large, grey, intimidating. Its high walls cast long shadows across the ground. As they approached, Mary noticed the silence: no laughter, no joy, only order, rules, discipline. The building looked less like a refuge and more like a prison. Several families stood near the entrance. Most avoided eye contact. Everyone understood why they were there. No one arrived by choice. A bell rang somewhere inside. The sound echoed across the courtyard. Mary felt William grab her hand tighter. The boy looked frightened. So did she. Inside, officials processed new arrivals. Names were recorded, possessions inspected, instructions given. Everything moved with cold efficiency. Eventually, a woman approached Mary. You'll come with me? Mary nodded. Then noticed something. The children were being directed elsewhere. Her heart immediately raced. No. The word escaped before she could stop it. The woman looked confused. The children go to the children's ward. Mary pulled them closer. They stay with me. The woman shook her head. Those are the rules. Rules. The word felt cruel, meaningless. How could rules justify separating a family? How could rules matter more than love? Mary knelt before her children, trying desperately not to cry. Samuel understood immediately. His face turned pale. Eliza began sobbing. William clung to her dress. Mama! Mary could barely breathe. She kissed each child, held them tightly, trying to memorize everything, their faces, their voices, their warmth, because she suddenly realized something horrifying. She might not see them again for days, perhaps weeks, perhaps longer. The attendants gently pulled the children away. William screamed. Eliza cried uncontrollably. Samuel tried to remain brave, but tears streamed down his face. Mary reached toward them. The distance grew, step by step, second by second, until they disappeared around a corner. And then they were gone. That was the moment Mary finally broke. Not when Thomas died. Not when she lost her home. Not when hunger arrived. This was the moment, because grief had taken her husband. Poverty had taken her dignity. But now the workhouse had taken her children. She collapsed onto a bench, covering her face, sobbing for the first time since Thomas's death. Completely, uncontrollably. There was no strength left to maintain, no courage left to display, only pain. Life inside the workhouse followed strict routines. Wake before dawn, work, eat, work again and sleep, repeat. Every day looked identical. Every hour was scheduled. Every action supervised. Residents cleaned, cooked, shoed, washed, performed endless tasks. The food was simple: thin soup, bread, occasionally porridge, enough to survive, rarely enough to satisfy. Conversation was limited. Rules governed everything. And everywhere Mary looked, she saw the same thing. People who had once lived ordinary lives, now reduced to numbers, records. The hardest part was not the labor, nor the food, nor the endless regulations. It was missing the children. She saw them only occasionally, brief moments, supervised, far too short. William always cried when visits ended. Eliza clung to her. Samuel tried to appear strong, but Mary noticed the change in him. The boy seemed older, more serious, as if childhood was slipping away forever. Each separation hurt more than the last, because every goodbye reminded her how powerless she had become. Months passed. Winter arrived, then deepened. Snow covered the countryside. Cold winds swept across the land. Outside the workhouse, conditions worsened. Many poor families suffered terribly. Some starved, some froze. Some never survived the season. Inside the workhouse, life remained difficult. But at least there was shelter. At least there was food. At least the children lived. And sometimes survival itself became a victory. One evening, while sitting alone near a window, Mary thought about Thomas. She imagined what he would say if he could see them now. Perhaps he would blame himself. Perhaps he would apologize. But Mary knew the truth. None of this was his fault. He had worked, sacrificed, endured every day of his life. The system had failed him. The accident had failed him. The world had failed him. And yet his family continued. Not because life was fair, but because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to endure, even when everything seems lost. Years later, Samuel would remember those months vividly. Not because of the hunger, not because of the cold, not even because of the workhouse itself. He remembered his mother's determination, her refusal to surrender, her ability to continue moving forward when every reason to quit existed. And that lesson stayed with him forever. History often remembers kings, generals, politicians, the powerful. But countless stories like Mary's rarely appear in books. Ordinary people, ordinary families, quiet battles fought behind closed doors, yet those lives mattered, those struggles mattered. Because they reveal a truth about the past, a truth often forgotten. For many people in 1809, death was not the only thing to fear. Sometimes losing a provider meant losing a home, a future, a family, a sense of dignity. Sometimes what came after tragedy felt worse than tragedy itself, and that is why Mary's story matters. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Thousands of families experienced similar suffering. Thousands faced impossible choices. Thousands entered workhouses with broken hearts, and no alternatives. Their names may be forgotten, but their stories remain, a reminder of how fragile survival once was, and how quickly an ordinary life could collapse. As winter snow fell beyond the workhouse walls, Mary looked toward the children's ward, one final time before bed. Somewhere inside, Samuel, Eliza, and William slept, a life safe, still hers. And for now that would have to be enough, the end.